The Game Boy player. What even is it? Well, it lets you play Game Boy games on a GameCube. It's a sort of sequel, if you want to call it that, to the Super Game Boy, which was for the Super Nintendo, which also allowed you to play Game Boy games. With the Game Boy player being newer, its biggest feature is that it allows you to play Game Boy Advance games on it.
Well, this sure is a Game Boy game being played on a GameCube. Few things I quickly want to mention. The Game Boy player does not stretch the game to fit a widescreen display. This is something my capture card is doing, and I do not know how to change it. The second thing I want to mention is that yes, I am still using composite cables in 2023. The GameCube is the only console that the Game Boy player supports, and while the GameCube does support component cables, which would look much better, or even third-party HDMI options, my GameCube doesn't have the display port to even use any of them. Now with that out of the way, let's get down to business. The main two issues people have with the Game Boy player are the visuals and input lag. When it comes to visuals, the main issue people have is the games are just too blurry. I do know that a fair amount of my visual problems I face come from me using composite cables and using the Game Boy player on a newer display. However, I can't deny that even with an ideal setup, the Game Boy player isn't the best visual quality you'd want it to be. When people say the Game Boy player has input lag, it really has me scratching my head. Like, yes, I can agree that it does have input delay, but it's not as significant as people claim it to be. When I first used the Game Boy player, I used it on a newer HD TV, and retro consoles just have lag on newer HD TVs. It's just how it is. So when I first tried it out, it had a little bit of Game Boy player lag and a little bit of HD TV lag. So I was like, man, people are right. This has so much lag, it makes the games unplayable. But now that I've given it a try on an older TV, and even my newer computer monitor that's designed to have almost non-existent lag, the lag the Game Boy player has isn't as bad as people make it out to be. However, lag's lag, and I'd rather it not exist. The Game Boy player has some built-in features. Since the Game Boy games don't fit the full screen, you are able to give them borders. 20 options to pick from. However, I'm basic and I just use the 20th border, which is no border at all. Next, you can change the size of the game from normal to full, which just expands the display of the game, which causes some more blur. The GameCube controller doesn't have a select button, so it uses both the X and Y buttons to function as the select button. The next feature is that you are able to change the L and R buttons on the GameCube controller to instead function as the select button, while having the GameCube Y and X buttons function as the GBA L and R buttons. You can also change the screen filter from normal, soft, and sharp, but I can't tell the difference between any of them. This could be an issue with composite cables or even my display, I'm not too sure. Next, you can set up a timer. What a weird feature for this, but I guess it's a good option if you want to play a Game Boy game on your GameCube, but you only want to play it for a single minute. Now you can keep track. Finally, the most useful feature, the ability to change out games. Instead of having to completely shut off the GameCube every time you want to change games, you can use this feature to swap out games and leave the GameCube on. My only issue when you swap out games is the Game Boy player will instantly boot up any game it detects the second it's put in. So if you put in a game, but you didn't put it in quick enough, or fully, you gotta go back to the change game option and try again, rather than just pressing A on the screen to boot up the game when you're ready. Which is odd, because if you leave it on this screen and you didn't remove the previous game, and you press A, it just boots up that game again. The Game Boy player isn't exclusive to being able to play Game Boy Advance games. It also supports original Game Boy games and Game Boy Color games. The front of the Game Boy player also has a link cable port, so you're able to connect a Game Boy Advance to do multiplayer games that way, as if the Game Boy player was a Game Boy Advance itself. Because the Game Boy player is just a Game Boy Advance under the hood, it doesn't have any support for using the original Game Boy link cable, which sucks, but it makes sense. Overall, the Game Boy player itself is solid, with some issues that could be improved. Well, they have. Kinda. See, the Game Boy player is split in two parts. The device that attaches to the GameCube itself has all the hardware needed, and the disc has all the Game Boy player's software. All of the issues with the Game Boy player come from this software, and not the hardware, so people have created their own version of the Game Boy player software that runs laps around the original software.
The Game Boy player. In the end, it's great. It has some flaws, but in addition, it has some pretty great features. It sucks we've never seen anything like this from Nintendo anymore. There wasn't a version on the DS or 3DS to put those things on the TV, and with the Switch, it has the ability to be a home console and a handheld one. It's not likely we're going to see anything like this anytime soon, or ever again.